Good afternoon, I'm Shannon Derejo. Welcome to our webinar on business and human rights, which will highlight major legislative trends and what this means for business in Africa. Today's webinar is hosted in partnership with ESG Africa Conference and is sponsored by Webber Wentzel, whose support has made this event possible. Today's webinar will take a deep dive into mining and agriculture and will explore human rights issues at a sectoral level in two areas that are of particular interest in Africa and where human rights violations have been experienced in the past. This interactive session will explore key issues for responsible sourcing and value chains in an increasingly complex trade environment. Attendees will be able to interact with the panelists and each other via the chat, enabling a rich conversation on the ESG ecosystem and human rights imperatives. The Q&A is also available to you, so please post your questions there. Both the Q&A and the chat are at the bottom of your screen. We are recording this webinar and we'll send the recording to you when it's available. We're also streaming the webinar live to YouTube and we'll share the link in the chat once it's available. On your screen now is a poll about the ESG Africa Conference, which takes place in October. We'd appreciate your response to the question on your screen now. While the poll runs, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Wendy Poulton, the founder of strategy advisory Strategic Mindsets. Wendy's main area of technical expertise is in the energy field, where she has worked for more than 30 years. She has a unique set of skills that combine strategy, sustainability, risk, and coaching. She has in-depth experience in developing strategies that integrate sustainability issues and addresses risk, both positive and negative. Wendy has for much of her career worked in the R&D space and is passionate about developing and testing new approaches. Wendy will facilitate the discussion with today's panel, which consists of Paula-Ann Novotny, environmental, regulatory, and ESG advisory lawyer at Webber Wentzel, Colleen Theron, CEO at Ardea International, and Ariella Scher, head of the Business and Human Rights Program at the Center for Applied Legal Studies. I'll hand over now to our moderator, Wendy Poulton, to take the proceedings forward. Over to you, Wendy.
Thank you so much, Shannon, and welcome to everybody. I see we have people all the way from Sydney and other parts of Africa. So we're really excited to have this conversation today. Human rights is something that oftentimes in South Africa, I wouldn't say gets overlooked, but it is not a real focus because it's so entrenched in our constitution. And ESG is rightly so bringing the human rights issues to the fore of business and government thinking. And it's really such a critical issue for the African continent, given our history and the real need to economically develop and transition in ways that don't leave people behind and that are ethical. And so I'm really excited to have an all-woman session this afternoon. I think it's the first time we've only had women on our panel, so that's wonderful. We're very happy to see that. And we're really going to get into, this session is a little bit longer than some of the other ones we've had, because we really want to get into some of the issues. That's why, as Shannon said, we're going to be doing a bit of a deep dive into mining and agriculture, but also have some presentations on what are the global trends that are driving this conversation. So we're going to start off with Paula-Ann, who's going to give us a short presentation, and then we're going to do the same with Colleen, and then we'll get into the panel. So Paula-Ann, over to you.
Hi, Wendy. Thanks. Thanks, everyone, for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be able to speak about these very important issues with our international counterparts and our African ones. So I think if Shannon could just share some of the slides that I wanted to introduce some of the points we'll be talking about today. If we jump to the next slide, it's really just about contextualizing the practice of business and human rights and why it's become so important today. As Wendy mentioned, at least in South Africa, we are a country of constitutional dispensation. And so corporates and states the world over are very much familiar with the Bill of Rights and what it means for corporate conduct. But that responsibility is typically framed within the state governmental focus. And within the global contextualized nature of operations today, we're starting to see increased scrutiny on corporate conduct specifically, and how their practices, operations, projects, and assets the world over, and in Africa specifically, are likely to contribute to human rights abuses and violations. And so we've seen this also play out in the more recent ESG awareness frameworks that within which we operate. So I'm sure everyone in the corporate space is now very familiar with this move that we've had from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. But from a business and human rights perspective, what that's done is bring a much broader stakeholder base to the fore of stakeholders and interested and affected parties who are scrutinizing and actively having a voice in or being involved in the decision-making structures of corporate conduct and corporate organizations' business practices. And so with all that in mind, we're starting to see much more focus being placed on supply chain interactions, value chain leverage of corporate organizations, and how exactly it is that corporate conduct can and does impact on human rights, both internally and in the external environment. And more recently, we've seen a greater focus placed on the African context because of the Global North identifying various countries in Africa and other jurisdictions as high risk from a human rights perspective. And that's given various of the violations that have been reported or alleged in recent times, as well as for decades ongoing. I think the reason we've chosen the mining sector as one of our focal points for today is very much the awareness of human rights violations and abuses happening in that sector. Often the example of the copper and cobalt belt in the DRC is used, where artisanal and small-scale mining reaps various health and safety risks that impact on the livelihoods of people, but as well as their life and dignity from a human rights perspective. And then we start looking at human rights, supply chain practices, artisanal mining focuses, and how that's deregulated or regulated and respected. And so this sort of sets the trend for why scrutiny is placed, why stakeholders and stakeholder activism is becoming more commonplace in the ESG space for corporate conduct and decision-making specifically. And we're also seeing a lot of legal developments coming out of this from the global north. So the EU and the UK have been some of the front runners in proposing and or setting and enforcing legislation around human rights. This is predominantly in the human rights due diligence space, and these are some of the things we'll speak to during the webinar today. But as a result of that, although South Africa and various African countries don't have designated human rights legislation at the moment, the likelihood of that coming out, or the likelihood of European and UK legislation impacting African operations nevertheless, is something that we need to consider, and we'll discuss a bit more today. And I think this whole focus on corporate governance as a result of ESG and how those all interlink is then a next program of discussion outside of the pure legal focus. What does the responsibility to respect human rights from a corporate perspective actually mean? And how far does it go in terms of obligation? And so I think if we just jump to the next slide, and for me not to delve into too much detail, I thought I just wanted to spend a minute or two introducing some of the principal frameworks that set the scene for business and human rights practices and the discussion that we're going to have today. One of them is the UN's Global Compact, which in 1999 was the first and largest voluntary corporate sustainability initiative. And that was the first time that, in addition to states whose role it is to protect, preserve, promote, and respect human rights, the first time that the corporate world was called to action and to have a say and align their strategies and operations, not only on lines of business success and financial parameters, but these universal principles that are centered around human rights, labor, the environment, and anti-corruption. And I think in the lead up to ESG Africa, which many of you will now understand in a lot more detail and follow the trends and evolutions in the ESG world more broadly, its roots and foundations are far beyond us, and they have been in place since at least the 1983 conceptualization or definition of sustainable development. The UN and its various working groups have had various work streams around aspects of E, S, and G, and of which today for crucial importance, human rights is one of them. So if we jump to the next slide, beyond the Global Compact, the next framework, not legislation, the next framework guideline that was established and is now more and more being enforced and relied upon as the UN's guiding principles on business and human rights. These were published as far back as 2011, but are now gaining more and more prominence in the corporate space. And we'll talk about some of the drivers and reasons why of that today. But they're really seen as the first global standard on preventing human rights impacts that are adverse, both at a state level and a corporate level, and how both states and corporates are meant to address negative human rights impacts where they have occurred. So given that it was the first global standard and it has the most support from a UN member state perspective, it has been implemented in various other frameworks like the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. It's therefore been taken as the universal benchmark for, from our perspective at least, corporates' obligation to and responsibility to respect human rights. And these UNGPs thus form the initiating framework and the base set of guidelines on how corporates are meant to evolve and undertake that responsibility. And that's typically in the space of human rights due diligence and all the concepts that unfold with that due diligence exercise. And we'll also touch on what human rights due diligence is today. And so I think a parting note from me before we start on in this conversation is that there is this evolving policy and regulatory landscape around business human rights that corporates need to be well aware of today. But outside of that, they also need to become aware of and really engage with the nuances that underpin the respect and the obligation for human rights respect and what that means from a risk to people perspective as opposed to a risk to the business. And these are just some of the topics that we'll uncover today with our esteemed panelists. So thank you, Wendy.
Thank you, Paula-Ann, for that great overview of what's happening at the global level. We're now going to turn to Colleen, who's going to give us some examples at what's happening at national or regional levels and some of the legislation that is now evolving on human rights. So, Colleen, over to you.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And if you don't mind, Shannon, just pulling up my slides. So good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you all today, and especially to be on this panel with our previous conversations with everybody involved. So as I think Wendy had introduced me, or maybe Shannon, my name is Colleen Theron, if we go to the next slide. And I'm a tri-qualified lawyer and the founder of Ardea International. Go to the next slide. And we are a specialist sustainability business and human rights consultancy with particular expertise in addressing modern slavery and forced labor. And we work across a lot of different sectors, as you'll see, and internationally. And I think where we might be slightly different to a law firm and perhaps some other consultancies is that we do harness our legal expertise. All my team are lawyers or have background in law, and to put the law into practice. And I'm going to hopefully share some ideas with you today around some of these challenges that are arising as a result of that change, as Paula has very clearly set out in between the voluntary frameworks and policy and emerging legislation. So if we just go to the next slide, please, Shannon. I think just to reiterate what Paula had said, there are two particular standards at international level which corporates are having to think about in addressing how they manage their business from a human rights and also from an environmental perspective, and particularly setting their due diligence standards. And what is particularly relevant about the UN guiding principles on business and human rights and also the OECD guidelines is that they are both frameworks that now underpin emerging legislation. And whereas I think businesses in the past have very much thought that this is something that's a nice to have that you might want to do, it is changing, particularly in respect of the legislation that we're seeing in the EU and and actually across many jurisdictions, where there is a requirement that businesses can demonstrate that they are integrating and embedding the principles in these documents into their practices so that they can meet the legislation. And if we go to the next slide, please. And I think what's worth mentioning is that, you know, the growth in mandatory due diligence rose because there wasn't enough large-scale improvement in relation to voluntary action. We just didn't see the kind of significant improvements that were expected in, from 2011 when the UN guiding principles came into force. And as a result, governments has just started taking a much more proactive stance to develop legislation, which was going to ensure that companies were going to have to demonstrate how they foster both a sustainable and responsible way of behaving. And the slide that follows is really just a snapshot of how the legislation has evolved in the last 10 years. I've been a lawyer for a longer time than 10 years, and the shift has been quite remarkable. I think, as you can see from the slide, that there are laws that are addressing modern slavery, specifically in some instances. There are laws that address human rights, but actually the trend is that the laws are covering both human rights and environment. And I think what that means for business is, how are they going to tackle these things together so that they don't work in silos? How do they manage their processes, their due diligence processes and procedures and policies, so that they have an integrated way of ensuring they understand what their actual and their potential impacts are? And if we go to the next slide, I think what's particularly interesting when you look at the context of emerging legislation is how this might impact on countries that are not based in the EU, or countries that may not, companies that may not be actually operating in some of the more developed nations. And certainly a trend we've also seen is a rise in regulation that is addressing imports. So we're seeing import bans. There is a proposal at the EU level for regulation that will restrict the import and the export of products from the EU that may be tainted with forced labor and child labor. And America already has had this kind of legislation in place, and it's very active. And this is an example taken from a withhold release order website linked to the US law. And it is indicating that, there has been tobacco from Malawi that has been stopped at port, and that tobacco is not released into the American market because the company has not been able to demonstrate that they have actually got the correct procedures in place to ensure that social compliance requirements by this law is being met. I actually think that this might have been recently updated, that there's a modification to the order. So just in case I've got it wrong, I think Limleaf may now have some of that tobacco that is now being released. And I think if we go to the next slide, why that is relevant to the African market is that the main trading goods partner for Africa is the EU. So it has a very large export to the EU. The other countries are China, India, the US, and the UAE. So whilst there is not import ban existing at the moment in China or India or the UAE, there's definitely import bans in the US, and more recently Canada has also passed legislation which is banning goods that may be tainted with child labor. Now, I think in the next slide, what one also needs to take into account is that this transition to mandatory due diligence does not mean that voluntary efforts facilitated by private sustainability standards become irrelevant. In fact, what it does do is that it is mutually supportive. So the multi-stakeholder initiatives, industry collaboration, standards that are set at ISO level or industry level or even country level are all requirements for companies to actually ensure that they meet their due diligence standards and that they are able to report on these under the requirements of the legislation. One thing I just want to pick up on, and we can talk about this in the question answer session, but certainly what we are seeing in Europe and in the EU across the international markets is that a driver for change in addressing the requirements of the legislation is not just the law, but it's actually buyers who are requiring their suppliers to be able to demonstrate that they are meeting the requirements set by the law or by the standards like the UN guiding principles. And if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to highlight that the BS 27500 standard, which is a guidance standard, has been set out for helping organizations respond to modern slavery. It's a standard that was published at the end of last year. I was privileged to sit on the committee. We worked on it for 3 years. And it's a great framework for helping organizations to understand how they address the risk of modern slavery and how they manage and reduce the risk as part of their legal and statutory duties. And Ardea is putting together an assurance framework around this. So if anyone's interested, just to get in touch. And then really just as my last few pointers, because I know we haven't got a lot of time and we want to allow for questions and answers. If we go to the next slide. I lost time with COVID. I think it was 2022. We ran a survey for companies in Africa asking or trying to get some insights as to their understanding on business and human rights. And what is interesting from these survey results is that whilst there was a lot of confidence around sufficient policies being in place, at the same time, there wasn't an understanding of actually having human rights expertise in the companies that answered these questions. And if we look at the next slide, again, we can see that, you know, whilst there was some particular understanding of the concepts of forced labor and child labor, there wasn't necessarily the tools in place in the companies to actually address them. Now, those surveys were depicted of a small group of companies that actually were involved in it. We are looking to run it again. We have a white paper around this, which we can talk about in the questions and answers. But I think that it is a useful snapshot of where companies are at. And I think even though we asked African or companies that are operating in Africa to respond to the survey, it's a good reflection of what we're seeing across companies in any event. You know, the lack of internal expertise around human rights and business is very common. The lack of understanding of what can be done to put in place to mitigate risk isn't very clear cut. And I think that, you know, as the legislation is developing and as people's interest is growing, the maturity levels are going to have to increase around this particular area. And then in my last slide, I've just put out a few things that companies can think about in taking steps to address and prepare for human rights due diligence. These are sort of 6 steps, six things that we've seen being put into practice in a very useful way with the organizations that we have been working with. I would say, and this does go to the next slide, I would say that one of the critical elements, to me, there are 2 critical elements for businesses addressing human rights due diligence. And the one is training. So really understanding what we mean by business and human rights, what do we mean by a duty to respect, having a proper sense of what is happening in relation to this. And the other point is really around corporate culture. So the leadership buy-in, the leadership managing from the top down, setting a culture which respects human rights across both an organization and supply chain. And I would say those to me are the really 2 critical issues. So I'll stop there. I hope I haven't gone over my time. And look forward to having a further conversation with everyone on these issues.
Thank you so much, Colleen, for that great overview. I think we'll move into the panel discussion now, because I think you guys have both brought up some really critical issues to discuss. So my first question is really about, so given this increase, and it applies not only to human rights, but many, many issues across ESG, what does this mean for Africa? And the additional burden of regulatory practices, now having to provide evidence to the United States for your tobacco on human rights. It's a lot of things which, in particularly small scale suppliers, which comprise the bulk of some of the economic activity in Africa to deal with. So what are these emerging issues on human rights mean for that? So Ariella, I'll start with you.
Thanks so much, Wendy, and thanks to everyone for having me on. What I'd want to emphasize at the start is that these are not new issues and these are not only new laws. Some of these aspects and these principles are embedded within existing legislation across Africa, particularly because it's the extractive industry, the agricultural industry is so prevalent. So as an example of that, in South Africa, we know that all our law is subject to the Constitution. So as Paula-Ann said at the beginning of her presentation, everything is subject to the human rights principles contained in the Constitution. So business and human rights is not this entirely separate aspect of the law. It encompasses some of the principles that are contained in the Companies Act, in the Labor Relations Act, in the mining, the MPRDA, the Mining and Petroleum Resources Development Act. There's something in that act that requires any new mine and any existing mine over time to have what's called a social and labor plan. So that means that they need to assess what their impact is going to be to the surrounding environment and communities and account for adding to the development of that environment and communities. So these aren't necessarily new issues. It's just about consolidating them and ensuring better protection for affected communities, for employees, and generally for the environment.
Mute on Wendy.
Thank you, Ariella. Paula-Ann, your thoughts on what it means for Africa and particularly small business?
Yeah, I think just to build on what Ariella said, I think the importance of the globalized context in which business operations now have, and the way upstream and downstream has expanded so much, and the way supply chains have expanded so much, there's a very important element of understanding that while we have existing human rights obligations founded in existing laws across Africa, the advent of international laws in this space that are consolidated around human rights due diligence or human rights reporting becomes very important for African businesses, even if that legislation hasn't been promulgated here. And that's because of the value chain or supply chain focus of BHR. It's that we no longer look at your operational boundaries, the boundaries of your asset, your company, your organization. It's your entire value chain, all of your supplier relationships upstream and downstream, and how those relationships might impact on human rights. And so one of the examples is the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which remains in draft and is currently in its second round of consultation, I think. But there will be an element of extraterritorial application to that once the proposal is accepted. And what that means is certain companies, even in Africa, if you're seen to have a business presence within the parameters prescribed in the directive in the EU, you will be subject to those laws. Even remotely or indirectly, if you are not having some form of footprint or presence in those jurisdictions, the fact of your globalized or multinational supply chain at the moment means that invariably, if someone above you in another jurisdiction is requiring human rights performance data or disclosure metrics to report on, and they need that from you, you need to be undertaking some form of adequate and sufficient human rights due diligence yourself in order to give them that information. But I think a second point worth considering is that all of these new or holistic or consolidated BHR laws that are coming out of the global north, there is an element of foreplanning and proactivity that comes from us tracking them in our jurisdictions here, because they give us a bit of insight into what new laws might be implemented here in the future. You know, one of the examples in the green finance space is the EU taxonomy. South Africa then a few years later published and implements now its own green finance taxonomy. These new laws around ESG disclosure and reporting and all the various frameworks and standards that exist at a voluntary and more mandatory level internationally resulted in our Johannesburg Stock Exchange publishing its own disclosure guidance. And the reason that that's important, A, from a planning perspective, is so that corporates know what might be coming, but B, for African, South African, global South corporates to have a say in what those laws might look like. You know, one of the biggest criticisms of the EU CSDDD is that there was not or insufficient participation from the global South. Most of the human rights impacts are happening on the ground here, but are trying to be regulated at the North level. And so it's important for the corporates here, where these laws are going to be applying to your businesses and your entire value chains, to have a say in what they might look like from a regulatory perspective going forward. And I think before you pass on, one final point worth considering is that outside of the legislative framework alone, BHR practices are moving to becoming more mandatory, and the corporate responsibility to respect human rights is evolving into an obligation, which has much more liability attached to it outside of the pure legal framework. And that's as a result of international companies imposing these kinds of obligations through transaction agreements, new supply chain contracting terms, and you'll see elements like having to conduct a human rights due diligence being a contractual term before funding flows to the refinancing of your project, for example. So understanding that through corporate and commercial transactions outside of the pure legal framework itself, you may still then be held to task on your obligations to respect human rights.
Thank you, Paula. Colleen, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Paula, thank you. That was, so succinctly put, and funny enough, there were similar points to what I had down. So maybe, just to build on what you said, I think the point made about high risk sectors is very pertinent, because it will be caught by the EU due diligence legislation, the corporate sustainability due diligence legislation. But actually, if one looks at the UN guiding principles for a number of companies, they are looking at enhanced due diligence when they've done their supply chain mapping in any event. So I think, where you sit, whether it's going to come under the law or not, it's likely that if you're in a high risk sector, the understanding that you're going to have to be more transparent and accountable is something that I think is a challenge for a lot of companies at the moment. It's really coming to grips with what does that mean in practice. And, we're doing a collaborative project on understanding exploitation in the food sector in South Africa at the moment. And what is particularly interesting working with the companies that are involved is to that point as well about what does it mean practically, the foreplanning bit. So if you are being asked to actually demonstrate what you're doing, it means that as a business of itself, you have to do your own gap analysis around what you are currently doing and what is going to be required for you to meet those standards. And in our experience, for many companies, this is a 2-year, maybe 3-year journey, because it's getting your corporate governance right, it's fixing your commitment, it's understanding who needs to be trained and how, and then it's also about data and measuring your effectiveness, bringing in your stakeholders. So, I think for the organizations perhaps listening to this, it's very much a question of taking away where are we now and what is it that we need to be doing if we are going to be asked to fulfill these transparency and accountability requirements. And I think that's the challenge for me and on a practical level for organizations.
No, thank you. And as I was saying earlier, this is a microcosm of the bigger ESG. You've got to be transparent across and have data across a whole different range of issues. And I think, excuse me, that has been part of the problem. But I wanted to pick up on something that Paula said, because it's something that's very close to my heart, having worked a lot at the UN level in business, is how do we better get the global South voice into these kinds of discussions? The UN is one mechanism of doing that, but what are the others? Because, having been to many of these sessions, you will have one representative from an African country at a climate change meeting that has 50 million parallel sessions going on at the same time, and you just cannot reach all of them. And I know there's been discussions around BRICS perhaps playing this role of those emerging developing countries starting to play a different role in the international process that sets some of these global, but also how do you at a national, like an EU level? Is it a trade negotiation level? How would you see this happening? Because it really is a very, very tricky issue for developing country businesses' voices to be held. So Ariella, do you want to go first again?
Sure, and maybe I'm going to give a bit of a different perspective on that. But I would say that as much as the Global South businesses need to be involved in these spaces and engaging and heard, so do the potential victims of any human rights violations. So the affected communities, the employees through labor unions, civil society need to also be in those spaces. And I think that fortunately or unfortunately, the climate crisis is demonstrating that even if we want to exclusively take important decisions in the global north, the large impact is going to be in the global south. So we have to bring the global south into these discussions, not just as a tick box exercise, but so that we can engage, understand what's happening on the ground. Because I think as Paula-Ann said, if they're having the discussions at EU level about the sustainability directive, and you're not firstly speaking to global south countries to understand how their operations work, but also if you're not bringing in affected communities from the global south, how do you understand what kind of violations you're supposed to be guarding against?
Colleen, do you want to add on to what Paula-Ann was saying?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. The voice of stakeholders. How do you do that? Because that's really what it is at a corporate level as well as at a policy making level. I mean, what I would say last year when I attended the Business and Human Rights Forum in Geneva, which is an annual forum, I think it was the first time that I saw so many different voices being brought in at with one of the panels around these issues. So perhaps there's more of an awakening about it. I think it's inevitably also a political issue. How is it driven at political policy level? And that we don't have control over. We can try and influence in different ways, but I think certainly where it's important, I would say, if you break this down to a company level, if you are a company that's going to have to comply with the requirements of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, you want to be starting that conversation with your stakeholders in the right places. Sorry.
Thank you. Paula-Ann, you want to add anything?
Yeah, just to add to Colleen and Ariella's points, I think there's also quite an important role that industry associations can play in this space, being like the bridge between private and public. And I think as we've seen evolving in the ESG space most recently, a lot of the industry associations adopt these international frameworks and standards and then impose them as conditions on membership to their corporate organizations, and that becomes an increased level of risk and liability on its own. And so using those platforms to engage upwards and downwards and framing what's necessary to take into account the regional specific context of your operations becomes very helpful at that point. And even at the draft legislation stage, I mean, when the JSE published its disclosure guidance, that was preceded by months long, if not years long, of multi-stakeholder engagement and how it needs to be, how they need to take on board and use the global standards as their baseline or their foundation, but adapt them to our regional specific challenges and contexts. And all the stakeholders that were affected by that were part of those discussions. And those are often, I mean, everyone's very familiar about public participation in South Africa. We have very strong and regimented rules around that. And hopefully in other African jurisdictions, we have the same. So it's just being aware of these developments when they come out, starting to increase your knowledge, build capacity within your organizations on the scope and extent of human rights, BHR practices, and what it means from a responsibility and an obligation perspective, so that when your chance comes to have these conversations with the other stakeholders, to do so. And I think just to add on to one of the points that Colleen made, again, through your supply chain and your contractual negotiations, there's this concept in the UNGPs of leverage, and bigger organizations are seen as having the ability to leverage their influence over the supplier engagement or the contractual engagement, and thereby encourage more positive BHR practices. And in having those open discussions and mutual discussions, you're likely to affect the changes that are needed.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean, as I was saying earlier, it applies to many things, right? So it's not only about human rights. And one of the things that we have been really trying to promote through the ESG Africa conference is this concept of transformative ESG, that if you use it or apply it in a way that gets you ahead of your competition, it really is a big plus and not a negative, and yet another thing that we have to do. So how would you guys see business and human rights fitting into the broader responsible sourcing discussion and the broader discussion around stakeholder capitalism, for example, which is all these issues? Or do you think it's a topic on its own that needs its own special conversations? Colleen, you can start with you.
Like I was listening. I was sending a direct message to someone, just to be transparent. Wendy, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, and it's a really important one, because I think that when one looks at how people have typically grown their sustainability programs, I'm using that word specifically, there has always been a very strong emphasis on the E and not the S, or not necessarily even the G. So that kind of silo approach is something that's quite historic. And I think, you know, what many organizations and perhaps globally people have done is move from using the concept sustainability to now using that the concepts ESG, even though it's tended to be more investor focused, the ESG side of it. And I think inevitably, whilst you might need some specific conversations around business and human rights, to Paula's point about capacity building, knowledge, insight, stakeholder engagement, you know, and have a program that's strongly developed around that, to divorce it from the E and the G is nonsensical. And I think that that's reflective in the laws when we look across the fact that, you know, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive is focused on both environment and human rights. I think it's very deliberate to try and ensure that there is that integrated a means of addressing it. And I think that, you know, for these programs to really actually flourish or develop and flourish, there has to be buy-in that it is as important as the E and the G. And I think that's maybe that's something we can have another conversation on, in that what we don't see is the same amount of resource being put into the social, the human rights piece, as opposed to net zero. There's thousands of pounds being chucked at that, but there is little bite-sized bits of pockets being put into human rights. And I think, you know, to me, as this whole agenda evolves, there will need to be really mature discussions in businesses about the resource that's put behind the S of the ESG.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add to that? Ariella or Paula-Ann, go ahead.
I would briefly, Wendy, just to say that if you bring it back to responsible sourcing as an example of everything Colleen's talking about, is that it's gotten this increased scrutiny, and the spotlight has been placed on it again because of the globalized context in which we work now. And we've seen ESG shoot up through the ranks, and our understanding of it evolve within a space of days, let alone months, over the last few, even though ESG has been around since 2005 when the term was coined. But our globular need for funds to transition from a climate change perspective and to meet global GHG mitigation adaptation needs saw investors start driving the discussion around ESG and this focus on the non-financial parameters of business performance, as in addition to and not outside of only financial. But when you start understanding or looking deeper into the UNGPs and your full value chain scope within the broader context of ESG, you start understanding that BHR is a subset of that, and that all of your human rights cross all of those boundaries, pillars, and everything anyway. The UNGPs are founded in the International Bill of Rights. South Africa has its own Bill of Rights, but each of those categorize the various human rights neatly and from an understanding perspective very easily for corporates to understand. You have your labor ones, your political ones, your socioeconomic ones. So many corporates don't understand that your internal human resources function is a business and human rights function, because those employees of yours have fundamental human rights in our country and internationally, and how you protect them or respect them rather from a corporate perspective is becoming increasingly important. And the whole spotlight on responsible sourcing in our new age of information access and how easily available it is now to get information and to share information on human rights violations that are occurring in high-risk jurisdictions is really shedding the spotlight on this. And understanding the differences between your internal stakeholders, your external stakeholders being your host communities, your artisanal miners, your cocoa farmers, understanding how they are each rights holders in their own respects and how you are a duty bearer changes again the focus of your risk function within the corporate organization from not risk to the business, risk to those people as rights holders, but how those risks then eventually do turn into risks to the business if you're not respecting those rights holders adequately.
Yeah, that's sort of proactive. If you do it properly, it's transformative. If you leave it in as a tick box exercise or sort of an add-on, then it becomes a chore. And I just wanted to comment on what Colleen was saying. I heard someone speaking the other day on ESG in Africa, and they said the difference with Africa is that you have to start the conversation with the S, and we often start with the E or sometimes the G. So people will come along and say, climate change is a big issue. We need to do something about it and help Africa reduce its emissions. Here's some solar panels, you must do solar PV. Instead of asking the question, what are the energy needs that you have as a society, and how can we now find solutions that fit you? So, you just start in the wrong place, you get the wrong answer sometimes. So thank you very much for raising that, Colleen. I think it's a really critical point. I wanted to the one stakeholder that I haven't heard any of you mention is the consumer. And we saw what happened to Nike a couple of decades ago with, them almost going bankrupt because of their human rights and environmental abuses as well. But how critical is the consumer in this discussion? Ariella?
So the consumer, I think from my understanding, and this builds into the question about responsible sourcing, it's very much related to the business's reputation. And that if you can say that your business is guiding principles compliant, that can be something that if we can educate the consumers about what that means, that should be something that then gives you a leg up and allows a consumer to make an informed choice and preference you. But I think at the same time, we need to, if we're going to accept that, we need to guard against the risk that some companies are saying they're UNGP compliant when they're actually not, and kind of using that to try gain some leverage, but not doing the real work. And that becomes so much more important when you're working across transnational supply chains, because what a transnational corporation is saying to its consumers in, for example, Nike in the US, might be very different from the reality on the ground in the global south where the actual garments are being made. So it's about reputation, and that can be leveraged from the perspective of wanting to protect human rights by businesses.
No, thank you. Anyone else want to talk about the consumer? Colleen, you're unmuted.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. I mean, I think it's an interesting question. We have that a lot as well, like how it comes up and in different discussions. And your point, Ariella, about being careful what is being said is very much to the issue around greenwashing, which we're seeing hugely highlighted. I'm sure you are in Africa too, but certainly in America and here. I would say what is interesting is if you look at, and I think Edelman and their Trust Barometer talk about this as well, is where are the younger generation willing to put their money? And there's a shift, not necessarily from walking away from a particular brand, but engaging with brands that actually reflect your values. I think that's what is coming through. So I think for, while you can't necessarily have a stamp I would say that around social business human rights compliance is much more difficult than having an ISO standard for environmental issues. I think that visibility around ethical consumerism and ethical supply chains is very much what is now being picked up generationally, younger generations, but actually I think even, people in my generation beginning to think, why would I buy from a certain place if it doesn't actually reflect my values? So I'm sure that conversation is going to become stronger and might become a driver for companies looking to lead in this area with their story on how they actually embedding the practices, not just talking about them.
Paula, you want to add anything?
Yeah, always. I think changing customer preferences and expectations outside of having a very important brand and reputational component are also changing the way organizations are running their operations, down to the types of products they're even creating and putting onto the market. And I think there is, to Colleen's point, beyond that, the real understanding of the greenwashing risk. But from a BHR perspective, corporates knowing that greenwashing is not the only type. There's a whole concept called color washing, and pink washing is around misrepresenting your gender statistics or your performance in gender parameters that you've set for the company. Rainbow washing is the same context across your LGBTQI plus spectrum. So brown washing, again, from an affirmative action perspective. So understanding that what you are perceive as if you're meeting customer demands might come back to bite you if you're not actually performing against those. And again, corporates blindly committing to adopt the UNGPs and not being able to verifiably show that they are committing to or implementing the UNGPs as required in the UNGPs themselves is starting to open up clients to potential litigation claims and other forms of liability risk. So I think understanding the risks associated with that, and also tracking ESG litigation in this space in order to assist and assess how you adapt your internal governance systems and controls is becoming an extra empowerment opportunity for corporates, as in addition to a risk lens that they need to think about. I think one other point I would just mention as well is the whole rubber stamping or accreditation function that various industry organizations play is also starting to shed the light on how important human rights due diligence is from a corporate perspective, and you undertaking your own adequate corporate due diligence and human rights due diligence to your satisfaction that meets the UNGPs. I think just to use an example from the mining sector, again, I think there's still ongoing litigation against the London Bullion Markets Association. They're an accreditation body that approves gold having been sourced from various jurisdictions as responsibly mined and not subject to conflict minerals violations. And it came out that there were various serious allegations published by various NGOs in the BHR space around some of the mines being, I think it was in Tanzania, and where that gold was sourced from. And the LBMA could not have verified that as responsibly sourced had they done adequate due diligence into those operations. But then you find your corporate suppliers the world over relying on that accreditation and taking on the supply of ore, and then themselves being taken to court through the new UK precedents of increased corporate supply chain head office liability and the likes of that. So that's another important consideration to remember.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And I think it's partly answers a question that we have from Ekamini around it's all very well to have these laws and regulations in place, but who's actually checking that they're being implemented, and what is the cost of doing that? And how effective is it in making sure that that happens? So Ariella.
So I think the answer to that is demonstrates one of the downfalls of the UN guiding principles, which is that they are voluntary. And so being voluntary, there's actually no mechanism, there's no tribunal, there's no complaints mechanism in the GPs that allows someone to lodge a complaint against a company that says it's complying, but in fact isn't doing so. Also in the UNGPs, because often what we'll find is that the state will hold that role in the UNGPs, it requires of states to undertake and publish a national action plan on business and human rights, and to update that regularly. And I think an indication of how much the UNGPs are not performing at the required standard, particularly in Africa, is the fact that it's since 2011. So what are we, 12 years later? And less than 5 African countries have actually adopted national action plans. So that could be one way of monitoring, not necessarily company by company, but industry-wide or statewide compliance with the requirements. And we don't even, even that is not working. So it's such an important point. How are we monitoring this?
Colleen?
Yeah, sorry, I just actually wanted to go back to what Paula had spoken about around the point of mitigating your liability or at least understanding that there's potential and what we're seeing increased parent company and subsidiary liability for breaches of human rights. And whilst the UNGPs are voluntary, they are being pulled into the legislation now, and they are requiring that one of the ways that you can demonstrate that a way of mitigating your risk and that you're fulfilling your duty to respect is actually ensuring that you have in place the requirements that are set out in the law around understanding your potential impacts, your leverage, your engagement, all that sort of things. And I think a lot of organizations don't potentially understand how much of a shift that is also going to be in how they have historically defended what they do. So what we've seen here is a real nervousness around being found to have a duty of care. But actually, what we don't see being discussed enough is that, when you're knocking on the door to get in the court because you're saying you have a duty of care, therefore you have to do something. If that is allowed and you're in court, the flip side immediately for the company is, how do I dispel that? And how do I show that I've taken steps to actually protect these communities? And it is something that I think requires a whole new way of understanding how you mitigate risk around human rights issues and move away from a nervousness of taking proactive steps to ensure that you understand what you are doing. And I think, just on the enforcement point, I think that some of the law is actually requiring that, I think it might be in the German Supply Chain Act, that a particular complaints procedure is put in place. So allowing for, the ability for anyone who's caught with that in that law, which is a value chain based law, to be able to, for NGOs to bring complaints. So I think the monitoring and enforcement, whilst we always want rule of law, effective regulation, effective enforcement, I do think the enforcement of these laws are going to come through the fact that you can't borrow money at the same rate, that you can't sell your products to the right people, that you find that your shares are falling on the stock markets, and also you don't attract the employees you want because they're going to be aligned to what your values are. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Colleen. Paula?
Thanks, Wendy. If I might just add, and to build on both Ariella and Colleen's points, some of the things Colleen is talking to is about what we call the hardening of soft law. So while the UNGPs are a voluntary guiding framework and therefore considered soft law, they are being hardened and more informing legal liability through all these other avenues that we've been speaking about now. And I think your question is a very interesting one, and one that is constantly open to dialogue and debate from an enforcement perspective. And one of the recent topics I came across was around the French due diligence laws, or the supply chain laws, and they're currently subject to review. And the markets, they are asking whether an independent regulatory or enforcement agency or body should be set up for those laws. That said, I think given the gap in enforcement agencies, stakeholders themselves are taking corporates on and states on. And we're seeing that through the rise in ESG litigation. It started with climate litigation, and it's spreading like wildfires. And these have always been the jurisdiction of NGOs, but we're now seeing shareholders like Just Share being very vocal and active in the corporate space. And so various different types of stakeholders are starting to become actively involved in holding corporates to account. And when you look in the transactional space again as well, if you have signed up to a supply chain arrangement, or your transaction of selling an asset has been subject to these human rights principles or these UNGP frameworks, there are significant contractual consequences attached to non-conformance with those, which in and of its own is a type of enforcement mechanism. The fact that the UNGPs have been incorporated into the OECD guidelines as additional enforcement mechanisms, because they have established national contact points in each country or each jurisdiction that is part of the OECD. Once we start publishing all of our BHR practices and our sustainability reports, and those aren't seen by certain members of the public to be accurate, we then might find the advertising and standards marketing boards start coming to the front to start litigating against people. And more as a final point, we're starting to see the financial institutions and regulators in that space taking this seriously, because of the need for finance flows to be rooted in ESG support and sustainable development. And so, for example, in South Africa, our Prudential Authority is going to be drafting its own disclosure framework for financial institutions, and there will be consequences attached to that too.
Well, thank you. I think you've answered Olawamni's question, because he was asking about the national contact points. And I'm going to just ask a couple of questions from the Q&A thing. So the one is that how do you advise large multinationals? This is from Pangisa. Large multinationals operating in Africa to support small suppliers with the added burdens of what we're requiring. Have you seen any good tools, mechanisms, approaches that companies working in Africa have used to support their supply chains in this regard? Anybody want to answer? Paula?
If I could start by just saying that the UNGPs do acknowledge that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. So with the resources and capacity that a big organization might have, and that makes it impossible for a smaller one to do the same level or extent of human rights due diligence, following those guidelines in and of their own will give you the guidance necessary to apply what's required of you based on your zone of influence, let's call it that, within your resource capacity. But the UNGPs does have an associated interpretive guideline attached to it for business organizations specifically, which you can find online, which we can maybe share with Creamer Media to share with participants after this, which is also extremely helpful in breaking down each of the principles of the UNGPs as they apply to corporates. So removing for a second the state focus and additional resources. And I think the last thing to note is that it also very much depends on which sector you operate in. And again, industry associations are very supportive in that space, in that they have also issued varying principles, frameworks, and standards and guidelines to support corporates and operators in their industry. So from a mining example, the International Council on Mining and Metals has their own set of 10 principles and various very interactive and practical tools on their website that assists corporates in the mining space to deal with these types of elements, as well as the other principles that inform membership.
Thank you. Colleen, you want to add?
Yes, I mean, I think it's a really good question, because what we hear increasingly from our clients or suppliers to bigger clients is that particularly if they're asking for data, for example, around climate change and emissions, and potentially around workforce breakdown and gender and equality, that sort of thing, is that there is an immense burden where if you are a supplier, let's say you're a berry supplier to 4 or 5 retailers, that you're being asked different questions that are similar but not the same, you have to fill it out. That is difficult. And I don't, until there's more streamlining, perhaps at a collaborative level, as Paula is saying, with sectors where they might agree to have one set of questions going out to suppliers, there is always going to be that difficulty. I think maybe the question is also perhaps related to the fact that what we also see is that I don't think that enough businesses recognize the burden to their suppliers. And if you, in agriculture particularly, if you're looking at farmer level, what does that mean? And my sense is that there needs to be far more understanding of root causes of forced labor, root causes of child labor, real issues that it might fall to a business to actually help around capacity building and help around supporting that community or working with local NGOs. Because I think what I've seen across businesses in Africa is that there is the very real frustration that a sense that some of the things that they might be asked to be doing, the government should do, and because of corruption, because of a failure of infrastructure, they are not being done. And that is difficult. We don't, deny that isn't difficult. But I do think that for corporates, really understanding your base supply chain and understanding how interventions as part of your duty to respect and part of your remediation requirements, looking at those on a circumstance basis and looking at where you have your strongest leverage to be able to try and work with supporting your suppliers, be that in training, be that with, a social and community programs. I think those are the things that need a lot more maturity. Certainly in my experience, working with, global companies and seeing the impact on this with their suppliers of these laws and requirements.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to add on that topic? No. Okay, I'd like to turn the conversation a little bit inwards now. We've been talking a lot about working with supply chains and things, but see, Usman raised the issue in the Q&A around company culture. And this is obviously a critical thing for ESG in general, but I think particularly for things that are human related, like diversity and inclusion, human rights, all of these other big issues, it's really critical. So, and we also have the role of boards with the obligations on them in terms of King and other governance requirements that they have to do. So, Colleen, I'll start with you. What do you think is the role of boards in all of this, and in particular in setting company culture, and how do we speed up that process?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I mean, I think we all know that a company's culture and tone is set by its directors, and what they want, how they want a company to be run is really set at that level. And so I think it's inevitable and critical that your boards are sufficiently aware of these issues. I've noticed that board awareness around business and human rights issues is not as strong as around climate change. We know that's because of the media and the laws and again, that resource issue. So I think, there is definitely a role for boards to be better equipped. I think boards need to be challenged. I don't think many boards, whilst they're trying to, say, address diversity and inclusion and equality, personally, I think a lot of them do not have the skills around business and human rights. I think it's something they've not even asked as to whether there's a gap, and that needs to be challenged. I think taking responsibility and accountability for these issues is another big area that requires education and probably ramping up for boards, because a lot of what I see in governance frameworks is a lot of the accountability and transparency is left at an executive board level, which is practical because they're implementing things. But if you look at the law and the UNGPs, there's really a requirement that someone at senior in a board level will take responsibility for these particular issues. So, so I guess, to wrap up my thoughts is company culture is absolutely critical. And, investment in training and understanding and collaboration, again, I think boards taking the time to understand with their executive committees, their sustainability committees, what are the issues, ensuring that the right information is fed up to them in their reports so that they are able to ask the right questions and are able to spot where their skill gaps are. I think that's really important.
Thank you, Colleen. Ariella?
Thanks. I don't have anything to add to what Colleen said. She's covered everything.
Thanks. Paula-Ann, do you have anything to add?
Always. I would just add, I lost my train of thought now. I would just add the following, yes, to give a nod to corporates that do have a good culture, because a lot of them are already very well organized and respectful of their worker bases, and they have a very good human rights focus. And some of the things we've noticed is that all that's missing is the narrative and the language that's being used to meet other stakeholder expectations. So a lot of the time you would do a governance review and check that, yes, you actually have sufficient policies, or for now, in terms of your salient and priority human rights impacts within your labor force, all that's necessary is to upskill, again, like Colleen said, your directors, your line managers, and your employees themselves with the narrative of what the UNGPs require, what it means to acknowledge adverse impact to human rights, what it means to do a human rights due diligence, and how that's an ongoing process, which means even though we're great now, we have to revisit this down the line. And I think the other only points I would add in addition to capacity building is that from a governance perspective, policies aren't sufficient. It's great to have a human rights policy, your environmental policy, and all of that, but often where it's lacking is the implementation of those policies, or even enforcement of those policies within the organization. And so doing adequate human rights due diligence, looking inwardly, allows you to identify the full extent of your existing governance systems and controls and where the gaps are. And then again, how you can bolster and strengthen your organizational capacities going forward.
Yeah, that actually provides a nice segue into one of the questions asked by Rafiel, where he said, should we have double ESG where there's an ethics in there as well? Because a lot of this talks to ethics, right? If you're going to try and greenwash or pink wash or whatever kind of washing you're doing, it's not ethical. So, how important is that, Ariella?
I mean, we've discussed a lot about business reputation and from the consumer's perspective, but all of this is underpinned by ethics. The reason that business and human rights came about is because of a recognition that it's insufficient to just impose human rights obligations on states, because there are so many more transnational corporations with much more money, much more power than states have. So if we're going to leave corporations out of the discussion, then we're not going to be able to address human rights violations. The same with the climate crisis. So all of this is necessarily underpinned by ethics, by the need to protect human rights, the need to reduce climate emissions. And so I would suggest that it's already there, even if we don't state it so strongly.
Okay, so it's official. We're now talking about E2SG. Thank you, Rafiel. There's also a question around how do you push back, how do you address pushback from either internal stakeholders or suppliers around the issue of profitability and scarcity of resources? What are some of the approaches that we should be using to address that? Anyone want to have a go at that? Ariella?
From my perspective, it's related to what I've just said. It's what the climate crisis is showing us is that it is not sustainable and it is not profitable to continue on the path that we've been on. And I would say that extends also to the way in which you deal with both internal and external stakeholders. The way in which you treat your workers points directly to the sustainability of your company. The way in which you engage with affected communities, with populations around your business is also going to determine the sustainability of your business. And also the environmental impacts are of necessity, both on small and very large scale, going to determine both the sustainability of your business, but also of the human race. So yeah. I would say that we absolutely cannot ignore that.
No, thank you very much for that. Colleen, you had your hand up?
Yeah, sorry. I mean, just to add to that, just a very short point is that, actually, there's enough reports, and sorry, I don't remember them off by heart, but there are enough points talking about the fact that, companies that are not going to actually invest properly in their employees and their supply chain, despite scarcity of resources, are certainly not going to be profitable. So it's going to turn it upside down. I think that's a really critical aspect for those directors that still think about short-termism and profit. It's going to catch them up in the next 10 years, because that's not the way that things are going to have to be run efficiently and with integrity and with ethically.
Yeah, it's the cost of doing nothing, right? People often forget that. So we have another question on from Olawami, and that is, do you think we should have a standard for directors? In other words, they have to be qualified. So I know in South Africa you can do a director's qualification through the Institute of Directors, but it's not a legal requirement that if you're going to serve on a board, you have to have it, as far as I know. So would that help? Should we be educating our directors and boards more explicitly? Colleen?
Sorry, I think Ariella had her hand up. Apologies. No, it's all right, but it was just the question. I mean, in reality, you could ask the same question about not just directors, but so many people who are critical to ensuring that business and human rights issues are integrated. I mean, funny enough, we do a lot of work with company secretaries. They have a really critical role to play. And so, there could be an argument they should also be upskilled in this way. I think good guidance is necessary. I think really targeted training for directors, more of that is necessary with standards. I think we should also take into account that, most people who are directors are going to have a certain level of education. They're not going to necessarily, not be skilled in a lot of other things. So it's a question of what, in addition to what they need to be skilled to. And I think maybe what we do need is changes in legislation about holding them accountable for bad decisions, and holding them accountable for or more accountable under their fiduciary duties. And I think those discussions are beginning to creep in the courts, and perhaps more broadly, which if I was a director in a big corporate, I might be more nervous of, and I might want to think about what I want to learn so that I might not land up in jail or in breach of my fiduciary duty.
Ariella?
So Colleen's referred to it there, in that we don't necessarily have qualification standards for directors, but we do have fiduciary duties, which can be used for exactly the same purpose. My understanding is that fiduciary duties exist at least in all common law jurisdictions. I'm sorry that I can't comment on other jurisdictions. But for example, it requires that the directors always act in the best interests of the company, being defined as the shareholders. And there's an emerging discussion around what the best interests of the shareholders is. And if we're going to tie that to profitability, and as the previous question referred to, if we're going to tie profitability to ESG compliance, then you can draw a direct line between fiduciary duties that are required of all directors and ESG compliance. And also, as Colleen referred to, there is now, under the 2008 Companies Act in South Africa, a process by which one can apply to have a director removed as a director and precluded from becoming a director in any other company. So there is that system, but again, we do need to be testing it much more than we've done so.
And we've seen some of that with Just Share challenging certain AGMs and board decisions and policies and things like that, which is, one of the interesting emerging issues. Paula-Ann?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the evolution of directors' fiduciary duties is already underway. So there have been 4 international senior council opinions that have been issued over the last few years that call for the international markets to expand their own fiduciary duties to include climate change considerations specifically. And those opinions go into quite some detail of what is expected of directors to consider climate change and strategic decisions of the board. And if I'm not mistaken, the UK Companies Act has also already been amended along the lines of what Ariella has just mentioned, in undertaking or reframing the shareholders' best interests to be the interests of the company from a dedicated ESG perspective. So those evolutions are already happening from a legal perspective.
Yeah, that's right. The Act has changed, and actually there's also more requirements around disclosures from, more public disclosures. Section 172 of the Companies Act in the UK is something else that's, come to the fore. So I think those are really pertinent points, that kind of evolution of directors' duties. And also to say with the EU corporate, we call it the 3D directive, the CS3D directive, because I cannot say due diligence directive. There's very much a discussion in that as well around the director's duty at a corporate level to ensure that any policies are properly embedded. But also there has been some discussion, and I'm not sure if it's included in the current proposal, about ensuring that they take into account the interests of the long-term interests of the company and stakeholders, and not just short-termism around profiting.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. So I think that brings us to the end of our conversation. I think it's been extremely wide-ranging, from trade to communities and everything in between. So I'd like to just ask the panelists to just give us a couple of closing comments on, and just include in there, what do they think are some of the emerging issues here that we can expect to see over the next couple of years. Paula-Ann was saying it's moving so fast. So what is it that as ESG practitioners we should be looking out for that's going to happen? So Ariella, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Wendy. So if I can point to kind of 2.5 emerging issues that are particularly relevant for the African continent. We've made reference to the litigation that's happening parallel to the UNGPs, but very often invokes them. We've got some really interesting extraterritorial cases happening in South Africa, a few amazing judgments on parent subsidiary liability from the UK courts, some under appeal, and a really great judgment from the Dutch courts, which is also under appeal. And all of those are in the context of the extractives industry, but speaks to all the issues that we've been talking about. So I think we can definitely expect more litigation. The second thing is something I just want to point to, that is an ongoing conversation that also exists parallel to what we've been discussing. And it stems from a recognition that the guiding principles are voluntary, and that they haven't necessarily achieved what we need them to in eliminating human rights violations by corporations. So in 2014, South Africa and Ecuador, so 2 global South countries, proposed a resolution to the UN Human Rights Council that the voluntary mechanisms in the UNGPs just isn't sufficient, and that we actually need to move towards a binding international treaty on business and human rights. So this is incredibly political because it's the UN, but in October, we'll be going to the 9th session of negotiations towards that. As I said, South Africa is one of the 2 countries that initiated this process, but at least from the African continent, South Africa, Namibia, Egypt, Cameroon are all very, very strongly involved in negotiating towards that, hopefully a binding treaty on business and human rights. And then the final thing is that we think that in response to how long that process is taking, in March or April this year, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, they issued a recommendation to African countries that we actually start discussing and negotiating towards an African regional binding treaty on business and human rights that really, it eliminates some of the political discussions and issues that we're facing at the UN. And it can also be directed specifically at the issues that African countries, companies, communities, workers are facing. So I think that's for us a really, really exciting development. And maybe one day we won't be discussing voluntary standards, but we'll be discussing binding standards that apply throughout. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Those are both great points and really exciting things to look out for. Paula-Ann.
Thanks, Wendy. Agreed, Ariella, very exciting developments. I think from my perspective, I would just add that notwithstanding the quite lengthy timeframes attached to regulatory and policy development, corporates should and must by now understand that while it is crafted as a voluntary responsibility to respect human rights, the world in which we work now has increased that to an expectation, and the multiple other avenues through which you can now be held to account for non-conformance with this responsibility makes it now an obligation almost. And so there are various other means and avenues through which you could be held to account, which has serious reputational, as Ariella mentioned, and business, operational, profitability considerations, no less in the context of the high-risk countries in which we operate on the rights holders themselves. And so it's incredibly important to understand where you are on this journey and to start taking the steps, no matter how big or small, to come to an understanding of what is required from you in this space and to draw on the vast stakeholder databases around you to assist you in advising you on how to go forward.
Thank you, Paula-Ann. Colleen, the last word is yours.
Oh, nice. Thank you very much. I mean, thank you to Paula-Ann and Ariella. You know, I've learned so much just listening to you two today. I think from my perspective, it's inevitable that we need to highlight the fast changing legal landscape. You know, globally, we've talked about EU. We haven't necessarily even picked up on other areas in the global south, like in Mexico, with their proposed human rights due diligence legislation. I just think that fast changing legal landscape is something that's not going to go away. And inevitably, that is calling for an era of transparency and accountability for all corporates that I think that we not necessarily seen in the past. And I think there's an element of reliability I want to add into that. So to make sure that it's not greenwashing or brownwashing or pinkwashing that underpins it. I think there's one other area that we haven't had a chance to talk about today, but I think understanding how you disinvest is another interesting aspect, and as part of corporate culture and corporate responsibility that we're probably going to see more discussions on it, sort of not just cutting and running, but that disinvestment piece. And the last point, which we also haven't had a chance to talk about, is very much the growth in starting to understand the requirements around gender in procurement, in culture, in your business, in suppliers. I think that's something that, again, is a very big emerging issue that we're probably going to have to talk about more in the future. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you, Colleen. It's a really interesting point on disinvestment, and one I think we're sort of facing at the moment in the energy sector with the just transition and what that means for leaving no one behind. So that's a really important point. That's another whole discussion. So I think that just we have a little poll for people to answer before we go. You would have seen in Colleen's slides that, and if you're interested, you can contact Colleen about the training session that she put up. She has a 6-week business and human rights training program that they run, which starts in November. I see Ariella also put on the relevance of binding treaty on business and human rights in Africa on a publication on their website. So that also looks really interesting. Thank you for that. But we're just interested in ESG, from ESG Africa's perspective. You know that we do these webinars in between the conference every year, but we also do masterclasses, and we're just wanting to try and gauge what the level of interest would be in attending a masterclass on business and human rights. They're normally about a half day to a day long. So they get into more detail than we've covered here, but not as much as Colleen's course, which is the 6 weeks one. So if you could please vote, we would really appreciate your input about whether this is something that the ESG community is interested in doing or not. So please vote now. And Shannon, you can tell me if we are done.
I'll let that run just for a few more seconds. We've got 73% have participated, so I'll let it run a little bit more.
While that's happening, I just want to thank all of you for your very interactive questions and everything, and thank my panelists, and hand back to Shannon. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Wendy. As Wendy said, I will end this poll now. Thank you to everyone who's participated. I'll end that, and then I'll share those results with our panel later. And that brings us to the end of our webinar. I'd like to thank our moderator, Wendy Poulton, for enabling a thought-provoking discussion. And thank you very much to our panelists, Paula-Ann Novotny from Webber Wentzel, Colleen Theron from Ardea International, and Ariella Scher from the Center for Applied Legal Studies. A big thank you to our sponsor, Webber Wentzel, for making this event possible. And finally, thank you to the attendees for taking the time to join us for this discussion on business and human rights. We thank everyone who participated in the polls now and at the start of the webinar. And if you're interested in hearing more about the ESG Africa Conference, you can visit their website at www.esgafricaconference.com. The recording of today's webinar will be sent to you in due course. And if you have any additional questions, please be in touch. You can reach us at shannon@creamermedia.co.za. Thank you, everyone, for your time, and goodbye.